The Greater Montana Foundation is happy to present today another in its series of interesting people in Montana broadcasts. This is July 17th, 1964. We are in the studios of KBLL, Helena. Doug Sutherland is to conduct the interview that we have today. Mr. Sutherland is manager of KBLL Radio and KBLL TV here in Helena. Mr. Sutherland.
As a matter of fact, very instrumental in other Montana circles and Montana historical circles for many, many years. Mr. Alfred Tyler Hibbard, known to us here in Helena and through all of Montana as Al Hibbard. Al, it's just very, very nice to have you with us today.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be here.
We're going to sit here and chat a little bit mainly about yourself and some of the things that you've done and known about Montana and Montana history, and I think it's going to be very interesting for me, and I know it is for our audience as well. I understand that you were born here in Helena, is that right?
That's right. Long time ago.
Oh, not that long ago. Couldn't possibly have been. How about your parents? Were they Helena people? Were they from this area? Were they born here, or did they come across the plains or up the river, so as to speak?
My father and mother both came from Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the same town. My father came from Harvard, Illinois, and my mother came from Monmouth, Illinois. Father came out in the early 1880s to work in the United States Surveyor General's office. My mother, as a little girl, came up the river in the very early 1880s on a steamboat. And I remember with her mother and a twin sister and a brother
up the river,
up the Missouri River to Fort Benton. One of the most, I remember a few things about that trip that we're told to be over the years.
Mm-hmm.
The one most particular thing was that someplace in eastern Montana, coming up, the boat had to stop and tie up for 3 days to let a migration of buffalo cross the river.
Can you imagine that? My heavens. And that, about what year was that?
I can't tell you, but the very first of the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Back in the 1880s.
Yes.
What line of work did your father's dad?
My father's father was an Episcopal minister in Illinois. My mother's father was an engineer and had been here for some time, several years, 3 or 4 years before his wife, my grandmother, and the children came out, and he built as the designing and supervising engineer, the mill for the Whitlatch Union mine at Unionville.
I see.
He was a very able engineer for those days.
Mm-hmm. Get into this mining thing. Of course, mining has been one of the fundamental industries of Montana, one that in the past was very important and, of course, contributed a great deal to the growth of our state, and, of course, is still important. Perhaps less important now than it was 100 years ago. What do you know of some of the early day mines? When you mention Unionville, comes to mind Marysville and Remini and these places.
Actually, Doug, I know little about them. I heard a lot, but in the years when I would have known about them, they had shut down and ceased operating.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, in Remini and in Marysville, and Unionville, the enrichment was shallow, relatively, as the mining men refer to it. And while they took out a lot of money, as for instance they did in Marysville, they bottomed out. They worked out the rich ore, and then with constantly increasing costs, the lean ore could not be economically handled.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a matter of fact, while there's been quite a little prospecting, There have been no major mining operations around here that I know of since my course up in the Lincoln country. Incidentally, I understand they're doing some prospecting and some exploration work again there right now.
There's certainly a lot of money taken out in just the Helena area, certainly all areas of Montana back in those days. A lot of people became very wealthy very fast. A lot of people became very poor in just about the same amount of time.
That's easy to do.
I imagine so. Your father, somebody told me, prepared some of the early day maps here in Montana.
Yes, he was a draftsman in the office of the United States Surveyor General. And he formed a partnership with Mr. John C. Van Hook, who was also in that same office.
When was this, approximately?
Well, the first one that I know about was in 1900. And by a special act of the legislature authorizing the official map, my father and Mr. Van Hook made a map of Montana. I have one hanging on the wall in my office, made in 1900. And the thing about that is that in those days, they made the map from the original field notes of the surveyors, and every letter and every figure on the map was put on there by hand. Today, map makers do all of the lettering and all of the printing with machines. That isn't handwork. But the maps they made were very, very beautiful. And actually, they did them by what is now known as moonlighting. They made those maps evenings and Sundays and holidays to try to supplement their income to raise and educate some kids.
I see. Were they pretty accurate considering what they had to work?
Absolutely accurate.
They were.
Oh, indeed, yes. Just as accurate and finely made as anything made today. But they were professionals.
Right. And it took a great deal longer then.
Oh, heavens, yes.
Yes. It's fascinating. It really
But they're
is.
really beautiful.
I'd like very much to see one. I wish we had one we could show the people here today. Now you, I'll get back, I'll even get personal. What year were you born?
1890.
1890. And I understand, let's see, you went to school here in Helena.
I went through high school here.
How,
And 1 year of business college after high school.
I see. Well, tell us a little bit about your high school days. That must bring back some memories. Oh, it wasn't that long?
No, just the ordinary things of young people in high school. I don't think there was anything particularly eventful. I went to high school in mid-year, so doubled up a little bit and came out in 3.5 years instead of the 4. Then I intended to work a year, but along came the 1907 money panic, and I went to business college instead.
Well, there weren't now back in this time, around the turn of the century, and in this area, there weren't a great many people that went to high school. High school wasn't considered as important as it is now.
Not as much. They went to high school, but not so many by a long, long ways went to college.
And the curriculum must have differed tremendously, too.
Oh, yes.
Changing years. Now, tell us about some of your first jobs as far as, did you work while you were in school, or
Summers.
some of the first jobs you had when you were out?
Summers I worked on surveys
yeah.
for 4 years. Carried papers a couple of years, afternoons and evenings during school time, but that's all. And then my first job was really in 1910.
And what was that?
No, 1909.
1909?
1909. That was cashier of the State Land Office at the Cabinet.
Well, if my math is right, then you were only 19 years old then.
That's right.
That's a pretty responsible position for a young man of 19 years old.
Well,
Well, it is, isn't it?
well, it was. It was quite a... I thought it was quite a job.
How did you happen to get that? That's a pretty formidable position for a boy of 19.
It was just a mere chance. I happened to know some of the members of the State Board of Land Commissioners, and very shortly after I'd come back from University of Wisconsin, June, the then cashier of the land office, didn't come back from lunch one day when he had gone down to stop during the lunch hour and make deposits in the banks.
Mm-hmm.
So when they found him several hours later downtown, they told him not to come back anymore at all, and they needed to have somebody on the job right now, and somebody happened to think of me, and they called me up and asked me to come out and see him about it, which I did, and they said, all right, the job's yours, go to work in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
I stayed there 4 years.
4 years. What did you do during that time there? What does the state land office do for anybody who might not know?
Well, the state land office handled literally millions of dollars in receipts from sale and leasing of state land.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept the books and handled the money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As I say, a very responsible position for a boy 19. Now, I understand you were deputy examiner of the state banking department in 1913. Now,
I went from
at 23.
the land office
Mm-hmm.
into the state banking department as an examiner, and I stayed there for 4 years
Mm-hmm.
as a deputy examiner,
Mm-hmm.
examining banks and public offices.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the banking in Montana.
Well,
Here you've been connected with banking now apparently since 1913 when you were 23.
I went into a livestock loan business 1921 and was in that for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
We started a livestock loan company, and actually it was owned by the banks of Montana. It was started in order to provide funds during a rather difficult time of financing the livestock industry.
Mm-hmm.
And this company handled in over the dozen years it operated about $50 million in loans.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1930, while still operating the loan company, I went into the Union Bank and Trust Company as vice president and cashier.
Mm-hmm.
I had been very, very intimately associated with the Union Bank and with other banks in Montana, throughout Montana. I'd served for a number of years as secretary of the Montana Bankers Association, which was a side issue job, and had taken lots of correspondence courses in business law and in banking and so on over the years. So I went in as vice president cashier of the Union Bank and Trust Company. Then the president, Mr. S. McKinnon, died in 1934, and I was made president.
Mm-hmm.
Union Bank went into the Northwest Bank Corporation Group
Mm-hmm.
in 1929. I happened to be a director of the bank for a couple of years before I went in as an officer. And have been associated with the Union Bank and with the Northwest Bank Corporation, which is the holding company, ever since.
Mm-hmm.
I retired from active management in 1955, but have continued on. I still am chairman of the Trust Committee and
Mm-hmm.
chairman Trust Investment Committee and member of the Discount Committee. And
You mentioned the Northwest Banking Group or Corporation. Just what is this?
Northwest Bank Corporation is a holding company owning, I think it's something like 90 banks in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, couple, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of those banks have a good many branches, so that there are many more offices than that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a holding company. There is another one, headquarters also in Minneapolis, the First Bank Stock Corporation, which is organized on a similar basis and owning banks in much the same territory. The holding company came into being at the end of the 20s, about in 1929. It is probably true that there would have been a far, far greater economic tragedy in the Northwest had the holding company not been in existence.
And why is that?
Because they added strength to the banks they owned, and they were able to work out plans of getting additional capital that came in following that 1929 break, so that there were no failures in those banks.
Mm-hmm.
And further, not only were there no failures, but they were provided with the funds to meet the normal demands of business, which they probably would not have been able to do as individual, locally owned banks, and certainly they would not have been able to do it to the same extent.
Mm-hmm.
So that the two groups added a very great strength to the banking and financial structure of the Northwest during those trying times.
Mm-hmm.
And they, as a matter of fact, they add strength all the time. While the banks are locally owned and locally managed by their officers and by their directors, still the holding company does exert some supervision. They examine them thoroughly, and they offer information about economic conditions and money matters, information about conditions over a wide area that would be very difficult for one individual bank to get. Mm-hmm. They have, for instance, in the matter of buying market investments, bonds, we'll say.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of every bank having to employ a very high salaried, trained, experienced bondman, they can have the benefit of that kind of service in the management of a bond account, which is a very efficient and very effective plan and operation.
Mm-hmm. I didn't realize the importance of these groups, and I didn't really realize the structure. It's very interesting. We only have well, let's see. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your wife. When were you married? We missed her somewhere along the line there completely.
August 1st, 1917.
I see. Was she a Helena girl? Or?
Born and raised in Helena.
I see. How about her folks?
Her father was a distinguished livestock man in Montana who came to Montana as a boy and walked and paid a fee of $50, which was a lot of money, to walk with the Bozeman train from Council Bluffs, Iowa, to Virginia City, Montana, where he arrived in the Madison Valley on June 24th, 1864.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a real pioneer.
And he was, wasn't he? There was a lot of walking those days, too.
Yeah.
A lot more than now. Now, right at the moment, you're an active rancher in the Sebin Ranch, are you not?
No, not in the Sebin Ranch. I'm not an active rancher. I am an active rancher. My wife and I have a small place west of town.
Oh, I see.
But the Sebin Livestock Company, the big ranch, is now owned by my son,
Oh,
Henry.
I see. I see. How did you get from banking to
Been in it all, I've
ranching?
been in it all the whole time.
Oh, I see. I see. How has it changed? It's changed a lot, has it not?
Oh, yes, as has everything else.
Well, in the amount of time you've been in ranching, then, the basic ranching industry and there must have been a tremendous amount of changes in the last, how many years has it been? Huh?
Well, it's been 40-odd years, 45 years since I started ranching business. Started in the Seed and Livestock Company at Adel, which I managed for 30 years as a side issue, still working full-time in the bank, but spending weekends and so forth at the ranch. And there has been a tremendous change. We were in the sheep business over those years. Sheep have become much less important in Montana. Costs became so great that it's very difficult to operate. Also difficult to get the help. After the war, my son took it over, and he now owns and operates it.
I see. Back when you started in ranching, it was a matter of working with your hands more than it was machinery.
It was. For many years after we started, it was many years after I started before we had any kind of mechanical transportation, before we had a truck of any kind.
Your main power then was
horses,
provided by animals. And it took
mules.
And it took a great deal, many more men too.
Oh,
did it not? What do you think the percentage breakdown would be? The reduction in men to farm the same amount of land. The comparison between then and now, 40 years ago and now.
Well, we used to have 25 men in the hayfield, and now we'll have, maybe 8.
I see. To do the same amount of work.
Yeah, but we'll have $100,000 worth of machinery doing it now.
Yes. And of course, you always have to buy that machinery, so you have to get it one way or another. Well, Mr. Hibbard, you've been connected with money one way or another all your life, and early history, and your first job in Montana is being a cashier of this state land office. You've been close to money, let's say, working with it and with the finances of the state ever since your earliest days here. I understand also you were in the savings bond program in the war effort. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I became chairman for Montana of War Finance in 1941, prior to the outbreak of World War II, and I've continued as chairman up to now. Montana had a spectacular record in war finance. You will recall that the finance campaigns during the war were in separate war loans. Instead of a continuous campaign all along, they came 3 a year, and a very intensive one for a few weeks. And there were quotas set for every community, every county, and every state. And the quotas were set at figures that at first seemed to be completely unattainable. We had a wonderful group of volunteers, hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. We organized every county and every city and in the state. We had some conferences. The state committee director and some of us on each one of these war loans traveled around to every part of the state and held meetings, which were, of course, it was in wartime, and they were a very emotional, dramatic meeting. And Montana was first to achieve the goal, the quota, in every single one of the 8 war loans, the first in America to achieve the quota, which means that Montana people did a great job in meeting their responsibilities. But they did a great job in more ways than that. They not only did a great job in meeting the responsibility and providing the funds that were needed by the government, but they did a great job in learning to save. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people learned to save money by buying savings bonds who never had saved before. And we had countless instances where they told us about and told us what it meant in meeting emergencies and in buying homes and in educating their children and everything else afterwards. And Montana people still own a vast amount, tens of millions, well over $100 million of savings bonds, which has certainly added to the financial strength and the stability of the state.
Most definitely. Now, how about this Montana Taxpayers Association? You were connected with that for a good many years.
Yes, I was. I was president for, I guess nearly 20 years, maybe more than 20 years.
How was it conceived and why? What was
It was conceived prior to the time I went into it. Mr. Norman Holder was the first president and was the president, and up to the time I left, he and I were the only ones who had served. He served a very long time. It was conceived to work with public authorities to try to get the most efficient use of public funds, to oppose excessive and illegal and improper assessments and tax collections, but to promote the economical and efficient use in public office. Without any question at all, tremendous good was accomplished. We have been very fortunate in having able men in the management who are dedicated to the job, as is the present secretary, Keith Anderson, and unquestionably a very real value to the state.
Mentioned that it had done a tremendous job in several areas along these lines during your time there. What was an example or two of this? Some of the advances made.
The examples would be in eliminating illegal and improper levies, and in checking the procedure, the actual office procedure of expenditures, to be sure that they are in accordance with the law, and getting competitive bids, collecting delinquent taxes, collecting the taxes that are due, and in providing information to the voters and to the citizens as to just the meaning of what these assessments and costs are.
Well, I think our time is just about up. I wish we had more, because I think that we could go a great deal deeper into more of the things we've been talking about. It's been most interesting for me, and I'm sure very interesting for our audience as well, to hear some of the things that you know so intimately about, because you've been connected with them in banking and in finance, and in, as a matter of fact, some of the bare history of our state of Montana, a state of which I think we're all very proud and all very interested. We've been talking to Mr. Alfred Tyler Hibbard, here in Helena, Montana today. And Mr. Hibbard, again, thank you very much. It's been very, very good. Nice.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for the privilege of being here.
This is another of our Interesting People in Montana series of broadcasts. This broadcast has been another in the series of the Greater Montana Foundation broadcasts.